Okay, so what we're mainly going to do is discuss two emergent social problems that we're researching at the moment, which are adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, and helicopter parents. We've done a bit of work on them, a bit more on the ACEs than the helicopter parents. Both of these terms are increasingly visible in Britain. So ACEs and helicopter parents are talked about as problems, by which I mean the terms are used variously by growing numbers of claims makers, discussed more and more widely in various forms of media and other public fora, and are differentially the subject of policy responses. They're interesting to us because both are diffuse social problems, so they're much more articulated and much more developed in the US, which is where both of these social problems have their origin, but have certainly spread to England, and I think are spreading to plenty of other countries as well. But it's one thing would be interesting to know what you recognise and don't recognise from the point of view of your own societies, but we're interested in looking at how the problems spread, the way they get picked up, the mechanisms for diffusion, and the ways in which the problems are articulated. For the purposes of this seminar, we thought they'd be good ones to talk about because they both differently involve arguments about child well-being. The key point I think that we're going to emphasise coming out of it is the centrality of therapeutics and the therapeutic management of relationships and of individuals as part of both of these problems. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the context very briefly in relation to parental determinism, then Jan's going to talk about ACEs and I'll talk about helicopter parents. On this slide, the main thing to look at is the date. We're taking our starting point in Frank Furedi's argument about parental determinism, but the book was published in 2001, so it's now almost 20 years old. And the research for it is 20 years old. It was republished in 2008, but substantively, it's a 2 decades old argument. And obviously a lot has happened in 2 decades. So in a way we're trying to take that as the starting point and reflect on the way parental determinism has developed. He makes these basic points about it then to do with the interlocking myth of infant determinism and parental determinism, which we've discussed quite a lot, and the idea that this had already 20 years ago was exerting a powerful influence over how parents see themselves and their children, the extent to which parenting had already become an all-purpose explanation for pretty much everything that goes wrong with children. So this causality of linkages between what parents do and childhood problems, and then the emergence of public responses and policy problems based on this presumption and the interlocking myth. And his argument that he was already making then, that even though none of these policies work, they deliver disappointing results. The policies aren't discarded, people just make up new ones. And that process has gone on and on and on, which vis-a-vis our discussion yesterday, I think is worth dwelling on. The extent to which there is now extensive experience of intervening in society and the lives of parents and children on the basis of this presumption, but it hasn't worked. So in what sense is any of this made accountable or seriously discussed? So these are the adverse childhood experiences. And what you can see here is that it's a very, very, as Ellie said, blancmange-like substance, in that you have a move from serious sexual abuse, serious physical abuse to verbal abuse, all captured together. Emotional neglect, physical neglect elided. Parental separation is in here as an ACE, which allows you then to inflate the numbers to 50% of the population experiencing an ACE. And similarly mental illness, and all this is so these are
every individual could tick some of these boxes, if you're very lucky. So, they're kind of designed to inflate the figures and also to deal with people's concerns about very serious problems, but also to scoop in lots of the population to this to make the case. And the central claim is that the emotional becomes embedded in the biological, and this, this very messy slide, and lots of the slides are like that. The images are like this, where there's just everything is thrown at it. This isn't my slide. This is a campaign slide. And so the claim is that the things you experience in childhood that are traumatic, and we don't know which experiences will be traumatic. It could be your parents' separation, it could be your mother's depression, it could be sexual abuse, will become embedded in your brain. And some people will react differently, but nevertheless those things are still there, whether that's in your response to it or whether that's in the troubles caused by it. So it's very wide-ranging. As I said, it's based on this idea. One of the slogans is, your body remembers what the mind forgets. So the individual is not conscious, they're not able to actually by themselves overcome their problems because they are invisible to them and embedded. And so what the role of the state professional becomes is to draw out the ACEs and to make people aware of those. And one of the most controversial aspects, which actually has been, we criticised and then the government inquiry decided it was possibly not a good idea, is this idea of assigning an ACE score to each individual. And so teachers were quite keen about doing this for children in their care, to spot and tick boxes to add up an ACE score for each child. There were experiments with people going to visit the doctor, and they would all be given a questionnaire to recall their childhood experience to identify whether they had a high or a low ACE score. So what's interesting about ACEs is that it's not entirely preoccupied with children, and so on the one hand it seeks to prospectively identify ACEs in children as they're occurring to stop them and prevent future harm or to neutralise their effect, but it also seeks to retrospectively identify them in adults as an explanation for the problems they're experiencing now. So you could have a 70-year-old woman who goes to the doctors and completes the ACEs questionnaire, reveals that in her childhood she was beaten or sexually abused, and that becomes then part of her, it's difficult to know who will act on this and how, but the idea being that will be an explanatory factor in her diabetes at 70 or her coronary heart disease, because it's rated a biological illness, not just mental illness and emotional problems. So in lots of ways this is associated with the kind of traditional underclass concerns about people at the bottom. So most of those adverse childhood experiences would tend to be associated with disordered families rather than everybody, which is why we thought it's a quite useful contrast with helicopter parenting.
So what do you make of all of this? What does anybody make of all of this? This is what Jenny had to say overall about the thing when she wrote about it in our book. She said the main outcome of this process isn't a balanced understanding of the problems of hyperparenting. So there is an acknowledgement, and I think I would say this too, is that what parents are like has changed. Parental determinism has changed how parents are. That has happened, and particularly to more middle class people. So people are more preoccupied with their children than they probably used to be, and they do relate to their children in different ways. That, I think, has happened, whatever you want to call it. But her argument is that what's coming out of this is a further form of parent bashing, with the castigation of parents to anticipate and manage risks, but there's a simultaneous criticism for the failure to let go, which is what she then calls the double bind. In the vernacular, you can't do right for doing wrong, is sort of where you end up. And I think that's true. I suppose from the point of view of my initial questions, is that I think it is interesting because I think it is in some way a response to parental determinism in the sense of what parental determinism has led to, which is anxious parents who get very worried about their children. That's what parental determinism has created, particularly amongst the middle class. So in some way, I think this is a response to that. But I think what it does is just re-articulate its premises. And the key premise it re-articulates is that you read off problems from the parent and that you create these causal relations. So it maintains this kind of starting point in seeing these problems in the child, particularly their emotions, and then linking it back to a parenting style. So everything else that's gone on just kind of disappears. I think it does introduce a new layer of mixed messages regarding involvement, which I think is very difficult. To say in the UK, I mean, the relentlessness of the message that you have to be involved in your child's education, indeed from the point before they've even been conceived, never mind when they're actually born, and you are relentlessly told that you are the most important thing per person, determining whether or not your child is going to succeed at school, and if you don't do all the homework with them, and if you're not very involved in the school, and the endless state-organised incitement of parental involvement in a child's education is very, very powerful. I mean, you can't really be a parent in England and not be involved in your child's education. Yet suddenly when they get to 18, you now have this situation where people are saying, can you all butt out and back off, please? So it's a bit difficult, isn't it? So I think that's difficult, and I think it does avoid the problem of adult responsibility in general, by which I mean having a discussion about what we think education is and what we're trying to achieve, for example, and questioning whether any of these arguments that have been made about parents are really true in relation to education, but what we think it even is and its purposes. All of that has been sublimated in the face of these kind of assumptions.